Hi, I'm Chris Ketzley, Executive Director here at the Association of Towns. Talk of the Towns podcast is a production of the New York State Association of Towns and strives to bring the voices from across New York to talk about all things towns. If you're interested in participating as a guest, please email us at info@nytowns.org. The views and opinions expressed by podcast guests are of their own and do not necessarily reflect the views, positions, or policies of the New York State Association of Towns. Hello, welcome back to another edition of Talk of the Towns, a podcast where we talk about all things towns. Today, we're guestless. Today, we're going to talk about an important topic for our town officials, and it's kind of a difficult topic, but not really a difficult topic at all when you really think about it. So we're going to try to break it down for you today, talk a little bit about how OPEB affects your financial statements, affects your financial positions, and what you should be doing about OPEB, and we'll be talking about that in just a moment. Before we do, I do want to remind you that you can find us on Spotify, or Apple platform, or YouTube. And if you prefer to watch this, you'd go to YouTube. And whatever platform you use, please remember to hit like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe. It helps get our views up. And by doing that, it helps get us a little bit higher there in the ratings. And it's always good to spread the word too to your other town officials and friends and other folks around that are interested in town topics. So again, my name is Chris Ketzley. I'm the Executive Director, and this is Talk of the Towns. And today we have an interesting topic, which is really OPEB, which stands for, a lot of people say, what's OPEB, right? Other post-employment benefits, other post-employment benefits. And this is really going to be a session where we talk about these post-retirement benefits. Aside from pensions, pensions aren't considered to be in the OPEB calculation, and we'll talk about that and why, but that's a different calculation. What counts for OPEB then? OPEB is all about really what you owe your employees after they retire, and usually that's contractual. So if you look at your labor union contracts, what the retiree would get from you really starts then to flow into what your OPEB liability is, your future liability, financial liability for that. You know, retiree health insurance is probably among the biggest, just like it is the biggest for you right now, probably on your personnel line next to salaries and probably getting pretty close to salaries. Retiree health insurance benefits, those folks that leave and you still pay for their health insurance, that's an OPEB liability, and that is growing, and we'll talk more about that. Dental insurance, vision insurance, life insurance, any of the things that you have as far as perks for your employees that may be an obligation for your town to pay in future years is an OPEB liability. Now, many of you will know what that is by looking at your financial statements, but a lot of folks overlook it because it's something that you think about down the line, right? You think about, well, these are for retirees, but a lot of folks don't really think about the fact that they already have retirees. They already have a town of 100, 150 employees may have 80 retirees already, and every year you're adding more folks into that pool. So OPEB is an important subject that nobody, probably the most important subject that nobody is talking about right now, except for the Association of Towns, because we see this as a brewing crisis going forward. We're in conversations with the Comptroller's office about it. There's some structural changes the state can make to make dealing with OPEB a little bit easier, and we'll talk about those in a few moments. But really, nobody has paid attention to the OPEB liability to the extent that they should have, in my opinion. And I've been a supervisor for 15 years, and it's something that always concerned me, but really hasn't been talked about. And I think it's because, as I said earlier, it's a difficult subject, but it's really not. You think about it's a credit card, open credit card, that keeps racking up principal and interest for future payment. If you think about OPEB in those terms, you'll understand the crisis that is brewing, and you'll understand how it is compounding on itself as health insurance premiums continue to grow out of sight, unfortunately. So why does OPEB matter to a town? Well, it's a major, as I said earlier, major long-term cost. Unlike pensions, and pensions are treated differently in the state. The comptroller has the pension system, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that's 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 already funded. You get your bill every year, and you fund that to the comptroller's office, and they fund the pension system. So OPEB is like that, only it's largely unfunded, and there's a reason. There's a couple of reasons for it, and we'll get into it. One of them is structural that we need to address here in the state. But OPEB is not fully pre-funded in most cases, and most towns are paying as you go, right? You're paying your OPEB liability as you go. It's part of your health insurance premium line, or it's part of your employee benefits line, and it's showing up in different lines, and that's really forcing, I think, towns to make decisions between paving roads or hiring new police officers or meeting their OPEB liabilities on a year-by-year basis. I submit that I don't think that's affordable. I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it's going to be something towns can do. And what's happening is towns are being forced to make decisions between providing services and funding this line. And so it's very, very important. It affects your budgets, it affects your taxes, but it's silent. A lot of folks don't understand how it impacts your budgets and your taxes. Retiree health care costs are rising faster than inflation. Health insurance cost is rising faster than inflation. Many of you have called me and talked about the double-digit increases, right? And you know what? We're trying to address that issue as well. That's another podcast, health insurance premiums for towns. Why the state does not allow towns under 100 employees or more to get together in a consortium and pool their buying power is a whole nother story. But you're going to get me off on that tangent. We'll talk about that, and we're working on that as well here at the association. But, health insurance costs translates into retiree health insurance costs are continuing to climb. And so, we're seeing more retirees start to leave employment and get into the system. And that means more benefits need to be paid out. And that's a double whammy for you, because a town then will have to address paying for that retiree's health insurance in most cases, but then also have to bring in somebody to replace that person, adding someone else onto the active health insurance rolls. And that is a double whammy to a town. And so not having an OPEB fund, not having something that funds this liability set aside is dangerous, and it's compounding, and it's growing. It can lead to obviously higher taxes, because where else do you have to go other than the levy? And that's a whole nother area we have to get into as well, is towns by and large, unlike other municipalities, unlike cities and unlike counties, only has the levy to go and get the revenues, right? We don't have the ability to have a sales tax by right. Some counties share, some counties don't share. We don't have other, hotel taxes by right or any other taxes by right. The only place to go to get this money is in the levy, and that's going to hurt property tax payers. You could always cut services, obviously. That's an option as well. But it definitely is putting stress on budgets. There's really no question about that. And so this really came out of government accounting standards. I think it's GASB 75 to report your OPEB liability. So it's on your financial statements. You can find it on your financial statements. But what that means really, when that's on your financial statements, that means an auditor sees that on your financial statement. That means an auditor sees a liability on your financial statements that is not funded. So what does that mean? Well, bond raters, for example, will look at that. And if your bond rating can be affected, certainly, by the fact that you have OPEB liabilities that are not funded. So how does that affect you? When you go out for a capital project, you need to bond something, and your bond rating is lower because you have this liability sitting on your financial statements that the state does not allow you to fund. And in most cases, towns are not doing anything about anyway, but we need to wake up and do something about it. That means you're going to pay more for the capital projects. That means more cost to your taxpayers. That means a project is going to cost more. And so, that's one of the areas, again, that is silent that people don't necessarily pay attention to. And I say people, supervisors, comptrollers, directors of finance, taxpayers, town board members. These are all things you should be looking at and saying, how do we address this issue to bring down the cost of government? We have an answer for that. Unfortunately, the state doesn't allow it. And so we're going to talk towards the end of this a little bit about some of the changes that need to happen and how you can get involved and help do it. But OPEB definitely impacts your credit rating. And that's something that I think, increases borrowing costs, and in the end increases, again, places more stress on your budget. New York towns must balance, we know with this OPEB, we must balance keeping benefits competitive for employees, workforce development. We're touching on all the issues here today. Workforce development is a huge issue in the town. Tier 6, by the way, we do not see as a major deterrent to recruitment, and I think the numbers bear that out. We had a great conversation with the commissioner from Civil Service the other day. I think you saw that a week or two ago. But it still is becoming difficult to compete for employees, particularly on income, on salaries, and also making sure the benefits are there for the employees. So we have to manage this long-term financial challenge, right? And we have to make it sustainable, but still make it attractive for employees today. So right now, the only options you have to deal with OPEB, whether you realize it or not, is things like needing to reduce employee benefits for new hires, increasing retiree cost share, right? That's one way of trying to shift the OPEB liability a little bit. Or what you cannot do here in the state of New York, for some inane reason that we can't seem to get a good answer for, is create a reserve fund, right? You can pre-fund these issues through these liabilities through a reserve fund. And so, this is one of the things we want to talk about. We've started in a local government investment pool, an LGIP here in the state of New York. It's called EPIC, EPIC. It stands for Empire Public Investment Cooperative. We're going to talk a little bit about that and how we can help towns manage these liabilities through the reserve funds. But right now, and we'll get into it a little bit, the comptroller does not, the state of New York does not allow, I should say the state of New York does not allow, because it have to be authorized through legislation, for towns to put money towards their OPEB. It's just a liability that's sitting there year to year to year, and it's blowing up budgets and putting too much pressure on budgets. If the state is serious about trying to make New York more affordable, they have to do something about the property taxes, and to do that, they have to make investments or make policy changes to allow towns to make investments in OPEB. That's one strategy that's very, very important. So as I said earlier, OPEB is a lot like a credit card. You have a credit card, and there's no limit on the credit card, and it's a promise that you make today to pay tomorrow, basically. As a retiree who's maybe 30 or 40 or 50 years old, and they're going to be retired in the next 20, 30 years, you're promising them that you will pay that liability no matter what the cost is. And so you don't know what the cost is going to be in 20 or 30 years. And I know it's easy for elected officials, because I was one of them. I know it's easy to kick the can down the road. I know it's easy to say, well, that's a 20-year problem. That's a 30-year problem. But the reality is it's a today problem, because it's affecting your budget immediately. It's setting your town up for failure in the long run, which we all have a responsibility to make sure that we're taking care of, we're good financial stewards, right? And making sure that those promises are funded and those promises will be met 20, 30 years down the road. That's important for our employees to know that. So every employee, every union should be scrambling for OPEB trust to be set up, or OPEB reserve fund, in other words, to be set up, and to be supporting this, because this is an important liability that needs to be met in the future. And so, people ask me when we talk about this, because you could imagine Talking about OPEB reserve funds is not the best cocktail topic that people want to hear about when you're at a cocktail party. It may not be the most popular person that people flock to talk, but when you're talking about OPEB liabilities and how they're calculated, I do get that question. It's like, well, what does this mean, right? How do you figure out? Well, the accountants figure it out. First of all, it is on your financial statement, so you will find it. But essentially a formula, there's inputs into the formula, right? Number of employees plus the number of your retirees. They take into consideration actuarial things like expected date of retirement, how long people are going to live potentially, healthcare cost trends. That's the killer. That's the killer formula. Well, both, actuarial trending is going towards people living longer. And so again, this is becoming more of a crisis because you're seeing, unlike the 1980s, where life expectancy is going longer, you're seeing people leave earlier, and you're seeing health insurance trend cost keep going up. And so you take those, right? And I did a formula here, and imagine you have a town employee who retires at 60 years old, and they get $15,000 a year in health insurance benefits. These are common numbers, right? Not unusual. Well, if that person lives 25 years in retirement, so that's $15,000 a year, and we're just holding that at $15,000 a year. We know through that 25 years that's going to go up. Times 25, that's $375,000 in future costs that is not currently funded. It's not met, right? Now, you multiply that by hundreds of employees, and you can see how quickly that adds up. And I took some quick snapshots of towns around the state. Town of Oyster Bay has a $645 million OPEB liability. Town of Clarkstown has $264 million liability. Town of Colony has a $128 million OPEB liability. My own town of Glenville, a little less than that now, probably $26 million budget, has almost as equal $27 million OPEB liability. So you think about that, even smaller towns have tens of millions of dollars in obligations. It doesn't matter the size of your town. This is not a big city problem. This is not a big town problem. This is not a big municipality problem. This is an every single town problem. If you have an employee, you have this issue. It affects every municipality. And so, we talked about it, things that are factoring into this, health insurance increases. You're seeing those rise between 5 and 10, sometimes 12% a year. That's going to compound. People are living longer. Benefits are generous in towns. There's no really denying that. We can say that, maybe towns don't pay as much sometimes. We could talk about how Tier 6 is different than Tier 4 and, talk about those things. But the reality is New York public employees, by and large, have a really nice retirement package. They pay next to nothing in most cases for the retiree health insurance, and oftentimes cover spouses and dependents. So, most towns do not invest that money ahead of time, and they just pay the bill each year as they go for the retirees and their actives. And so, it's a ticking time bomb. It's a public investment, public funding disaster. I was looking at, obviously it's not a big city problem, but I did look at New York City's OPEB because I got to believe that's out of line. $100 billion. And so, that's just an example of how it shows the scale of how large these are unfunded liabilities are. And so, why do we not allow for towns to put aside in a reserve fund? We'll get into this, but the state of New York allows for reserve funds for so many reasons, but not this one. You cannot put this aside, and that's a major issue. So, you could look at a budget of, say, $30 million annual budget of a town, $25 million we talked about, town of Glenville, $25 million as an OPEB liability. Each year, that town may be paying $1 to $3 million in that to fund that liability as they go year to year to year. Think about where that $1 to $3 million could go aside from funding OPEB year to year. without a trust or without a reserve fund, as I call it. You know, it competes with road repair. It competes with police and fire services. It competes with new salaries. This is again where our unions should really get on board with this, because we are unable to bring people on when you have $1 to $3 million for some of these towns in liabilities for OPEB. It competes with tax stabilization. You know, God forbid the property taxpayer gets a cut or whatnot. But this is when you start looking at it this way, you start to see how this impacts towns, how it impacts taxpayers, and what we ought to be doing for it. It's really a tension between, you know, your short-term obligations and your long-term strategies to try to smooth out costs that a town may incur in its budgets. And there are political realities around this. As I mentioned earlier, I understand it's easy for an elected official today to say, let that be someone else's problem. I understand that we have to negotiate with unions, another strategic issue that gets in the way of OPEB funding, because unions have to be partners in this. They have to come to the table. And I'm calling on our partners in the unions to come to the table on this issue. Otherwise, you know, the options that you have as a town supervisor and a town board are, as I talked about earlier, you know, maybe you have to downsize staff. Maybe you can't hire. Maybe you can't fill somebody who is left. And so, you know, when a town starts to think about the strategies it has to deal with rising costs of any type, health insurance or rock salt or whatever, but if you're dealing with the rising costs of OPEB, if it continues to hit remember, it hits you in two ways. One is your current, what you're paying for your retirees every year currently. And then two, it hurts your financial standing because it's a unfunded liability that is gonna hit your bond rating. So you have to have strategies, right? One of the ways we talked about just a moment ago is changing benefits for new hires. I know a lot of times when we negotiated with the unions, I had 2 CSEA unions and a PBA in my town. And, you know, we talked about common and realistic strategies going forward. If the costs are continuing to compound and increase in future years, then somehow the benefits have to be looked at to try to bend the curve of all those compounding costs. And so, you know, require retirees to pay a larger share of their premiums is one opportunity for towns to try to get unions to agree to. Raise the retirement age for eligibility of paid. That's a strategy we did in my town. We raised the wage, and that helped us tremendously. Limit years of coverage, limit spousal coverage, dependent coverage. There's all sorts of strategies that can get deployed. Now, these aren't popular to bring to the negotiating table, no doubt about it, but these are things that need to be discussed and talked about and brought forth, and as a way to start that conversation on all the different strategies that a town may have in order to try to deal with OPEB going forward. So that would require renegotiating union contracts or negotiating new contracts, and that's difficult. Capping the town's share of premium they pay, those types of things, cost shifting the premium from, say, in most cases, towns 90 to 100% will pay for a premium. They could shift to a 70-30, you know, 70 town, 30 employee or retiree, or maybe make a fixed dollar, you know, contribution. These are all strategies that towns have to come to the table and talk about. Cannot unilaterally, obviously, impose this, but short of the state allowing for an OPEB reserve, this is one way. These are multiple ways, actually, to deal with the increasing cost. One of the things we looked at in our town when I was supervisor is Medicare, using Medicare more effectively, encouraging and require enrollment in Medicare. Because Medicare Advantage is cheaper than, say, private insurance or insurance in the market. So if you can move folks to Medicare, the town will pay less. Coverage is still maintained for the retiree. And as I said, we're looking at, here at the association, ways to deal with increasing health insurance costs in the active market, in the post-retiree market, and that's one area where you can look at as a way of trying to move folks into Medicare when they're eligible. Certainly offer buyouts and incentives is another way, lump sum payments, health insurance reimbursement arrangements, HRAs, that's another option for towns to look at as opposed to paying just open-ended, but to fund health insurance retirement accounts. And so all this will reduce or eliminate, try to mitigate, I guess, not eliminate, but mitigate future liability. And some of it isn't going to help you immediately, but it's certainly going to put the town in a stronger fiscal position going forward. And, you know, the only other thing that towns can do, and unfortunately most are doing, is to do nothing, right? Sweep the issue under the rug, to say, this is a big issue, not anything I can tackle. I can't get the unions on board. The state doesn't allow for pre-retirement funding for this. So towns end up paying as you go, and they don't pre-fund. And this is risky because liabilities keep growing. We talked about it, the compounding effect. Future taxpayers are going to bear that burden, which is huge and continues to hurt your credit rating. Those are all reasons why towns need to start dealing with this. But when you think about what actually works the best, and it is true we're late to the game here in New York, and so it will be a long-term strategy, but we've been talking with our legislators about this. The best strategy is to pre-fund even small amounts into a reserve fund that will be used to pay for the OPEB obligations in future years. I think that is what we need to really start talking about in this state. And, you know, right now, there are rules, well, always and always will be, there are rules in what the state allows towns, municipalities, and you know, general, to put away into the reserves. And reserve funds are really, you know, you think about reserve funds as legally restricted savings accounts, right? It's not unrestricted fund balance. We'll get into that a little bit in a few moments, but it's not generally just piles of money in reserve funds. They're not rainy day funds. They're not funds that you can just pull and use any reason. You cannot just create any reserve fund you want. And this is where the OPEB crisis comes into, you know, this is largely a crisis in the making by the state of New York and our policymakers. They don't allow for you to put away for this. So, and as you know, you can't just stick it in your unreserved, unallocated fund balance, because then you get in trouble for having too much fund balance, right? And so that's a major issue facing towns. So each reserve that you're allowed to put into must be, as you know, authorized by the state of New York, legislation. Legislature passes, governor signs, and general municipal law generally will allow that. You then have to establish a board resolution creating the reserve fund once it's authorized by the state of New York. And then it can only be used for its intended purposes. So you can't just take it and use it for anything. It's whatever purpose you set that up for. And again, the state have delineated different reserve accounts that you are allowed to set up for. And when you look at some of these and you wonder, well, why are these allowed, but something like an OPEB liability is not allowed, is a head scratcher, right? It makes no sense. There is no good argument against this when you think about all the different reserve funds that the state of New York allows you to set up. And I'll go through just some of them. You know, one is the Capital and Infrastructure Reserve Fund. That's something pretty common. Most of you probably have one. It's a capital reserve fund for buildings, for highway, for equipment, whatever it might be. You have also in, you know, this long-term physical needs type of account, you have repair and reserve fund. That's something you put away to help fund your repairs, your, by the way, future major repairs. So there, the state is saying, yeah, we'll let you fund we'll let you fund future obligations in the repair line, snow and ice, you know, those types of things. This helps towns to avoid, it's a strategy to help towns avoid having to issue debt every time something gets too expensive. And so we're seeing that with capital and infrastructure reserves. Makes sense. 100% makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is why can we fund that, but we can't fund OPEB reserves? Debt-related reserves, that's a whole nother. You can set up a reserve to pay your bond indebtedness. Again, a future obligation. You take a bond, you get the money, and then you have whatever, 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever it is, depends on what your bonding is, the schedule of how long you can put out those payments. But the state allows you to put a reserve fund away for that. And so, that's to help pay down debt, smooth the spikes in debt service, meet future obligations, the same thing we're asking for with OPEB. Risk and liability reserve. This is an interesting one because you're allowed to put away for workers' comp reserve, unemployment insurance reserves, again, future liabilities to protect against unseen claims, unpredictable costs of these claims. All of this, great fiscal sense, should be doing, are allowed to do, but for some reason OPEB is different. The interesting one is the employee-related reserve, and this is different than OPEB. As I mentioned earlier to you, the pension fund is essentially a reserve fund, right? Every year you get a bill from the state comptroller that says this is what you owe towards the pension fund. That isn't for the employee working today. That's funding the employee who's retired now and also meant to keep the fund viable for the people working today, right? So your current employees aren't collecting on the pension fund, but what that's doing is funding that so that those liabilities will be met when those current employees, those active employees, retire. So we can do this with a pension fund, and it's incredibly important, but OPEB is the same exact thing. It's just health insurance. It's just benefits side, that need to be funded. And so that's one example of, again, why it doesn't make sense that one thing can be funded but the other thing cannot. There's employee benefit accrued liability reserves. It's retirement contribution reserves. You can put a reserve fund to help smooth the spikes that come out of your pension costs. So every year, some years it may be, for a town, $250,000. Some years it might be $500,000. All depends on that March 31st date, on how the stock market's doing, right? It depends on a couple other factors too, how many employees you have, those types of things. But generally, there can be spikes in that. And so you can put a reserve fund away to manage those spikes and to guard against future costs. And so all of this leads to why not OPEB? You have to keep asking yourself, why not OPEB? These are very close, similar liabilities as OPEB, but not the same. The state of New York allows for, by the way, special purpose reserve funds, right? So some towns that may have solid waste facilities, solid waste reserves, electric utility depreciation reserve, all sorts of things, even airport funds for some that have town airports. Tax stabilization is a fund, contingency fund that can be put into reserves. It smooths tax increases. But towns are not allowed generally to have a general savings account. You just can't have a savings account, set aside money with no defined purpose, call it a reserve without legal authorization. You cannot have an OPEB reserve right now, as I've said many times during this podcast, set aside for you. That would be an illegal authorization of money. And so, you can't, the benefit of having a reserve is once it's set aside, that's what you have to use it for. And so it's a very disciplined way, very financially sound, very smart way of dealing with this issue. As I said before, you can't just keep it in the unrestricted fund balance, because that really is your kind of rainy day. That's really your fund that when you get into a situation, an unforeseen emergency or some major expense that you weren't seeing, that you could just kind of pull on those fund balance. A lot of towns use fund balance for tax stabilization, right? Every year they put Could be 100,000, could be a million, it could be 5 million, whatever it is. You take it out of your fund balance and you help stabilize your budget, annual budget. It's a dangerous practice, something I can talk about and how I managed that when I was supervisor, and I got us off of $1 million dependency on fund balance and brought it down to maybe 100,000 or so at the time. But those are things that you don't want to be flagged by the state comptroller for overfunding your fund balance. That's a hit in an audit. So you can see all of these issues that OPEB can lead to for towns. It could be a hit on your audit because you put too much into your unrestricted fund balance to deal with the issue. It could be a bond rating decrease because your liabilities are growing too much and you don't have anything against those liabilities. And so, you know, there's unassigned, unrestricted fund balance. You can get into all of this stuff, but all of that really is governed by the state of New York and monitored by the comptroller's office. And the comptroller is concerned that, you know, does not want to see people put away too much money, because that's really then you're overtaxing, right? So you end up overtaxing your public, your residents, and you're just putting money away. That's not something a town should be doing, and we all agree on that. And so by creating an OPEB reserve fund, allowing that to happen, then we'll turn around and allow a town to responsibly plan, responsibly save, and to protect the taxpayer in the long run. And so we've been working on this issue, as I mentioned, here at the association, and I'm very pleased to talk about one of the programs we built. So there's ways of dealing with things. One is legislatively, and we always try to attack the legislative issue head on, and we've talked about that, health insurance and OPEB fund, and print mandates for the newspaper, public notices. There's all sorts of legislative initiatives in our legislative agenda that we're working on here. Raising the retirement contribution, or not contribution, salary when someone retires and wants to come back and work for a town from $35,000 to $50,000. That's an important change we're trying to get done here. So there's a whole legislative agenda. But then what we do here is we try to build programs that don't need legislation, but we try to build programs for our members. It's one of our member values to our town members. And although we can't help with OPEB right now, one of the things that we built and we talked to the state about, because one of the concerns is that towns may not have the wherewithal to manage funds, is we created an LGIP, a local government investment pool. And it's called EPIC, New York Fund, EPIC, which stands for, as I mentioned earlier, the Empire Public Investment Cooperative. And so what it is really is a pool of shared investments that is created specifically for and by the way, local governments. And so it is something that will give towns an opportunity to invest their idle short-term cash, their reserve, all those reserve funds we talked about potentially, your capital reserve, your debt reserve, whatever unrestricted fund balance, whatever you have, it helps public sector. Basically, it's a public sector version, if I can break it down in common terms, of a money market account. The rate you'd have to check daily, obviously, can't really get into that because that changes. But the priorities I think, of this type of money market fund, this local government investment fund, is safety on principle. That's critical, right? Daily liquidity and modest investment earnings, because again, towns are only allowed to do so much with their funds. They can't invest in the stock market. They can't, invest in risky investments. And so this is authorized, the LGIP is authorized under state law and only allows for investments that are allowed under state law. So why would towns use LGIPs? That's a good question. In many cases, you could potentially earn more than you could in, say, in any other bank account, in a CD potentially, or any other type of account. It does give you immediate access to your cash, and it does avoid managing investments on your own. And I think that's one of the things that the state is mostly concerned about with reserve funds, is towns managing the investments on their own. something like Epic or these LGIPs that are out there can help you make sure you manage your investments professionally, not on your own. And so that's critical. I think it's critical for the state to understand that, is that there's a vehicle for which these OPEB trusts can be managed, and it's through the LGIP program. Pooling the funds, just like I talked about earlier with health insurance, right? Why the state doesn't allow towns to come together and pool their purchase of health insurance is, again, beyond me. I don't understand it, because it can help by pooling the law of large numbers. By pooling that purchase together, you will drive premiums down. This is the opposite. By pooling the investments together, it's the inverse, right? By pooling that together, you get economies of scale, you get professional management, diversification of single town that a single town typically cannot get on its own. You get that benefit by getting into this pool. And so, how it works, obviously, the EPIC Fund, and by the way, if you're interested in learning more about this, we work with PFM Asset Management. Marty Hammond is the gentleman you want to reach out to. His email is Hammond, Hammond, and then M for Marty, at pfmam.com, pfmam.com. They are the financial advisors for the program. They have long history in running these LGIPs in different states across the nation, many of them, 17, 18 of them now, here with the state of New York. So they have one in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island and other states. So they know what they're doing. They manage hundreds of billions of dollars of local government funds across the nation. And reach out to Marty if you have any questions on this whatsoever. But essentially how they work is you deposit your funds into these LGIPs. And again, it could be operating cash, it could be reserve funds, all the different reserve funds we just talked about. Someday, hopefully, it's an OPEB reserve fund, because I think that's important. Capital project funds, whatever. And you deposit your shares or units, usually valued at $1, right? And Marty can get into more of this for you. But the funds are pooled and invested. And again, very conservative short-term securities that are allowed by the state of New York. Some examples that the state of New York does allow states or towns to invest in include U.S. Treasury bills, federal agency securities, all sorts of short-term instruments like that. And these investments are really designed, the state of New York did this in order to preserve principal and retain liquidity, right? Because you do not want to take a risk with town money. You do not want to take a risk with taxpayer money. You don't want to go back to your taxpayer and say, hey, that we had a down market, we lost your what you paid in taxes this year, so we got to double what you pay next year. We definitely want to make sure we preserve principal, and that's why, for good reason, the state of New York has these guide rails in place and what can be invested in and what cannot be invested in. They're professionally managed, as I mentioned. PFM is the manager of the EPIC Fund, Marty Hammond. It has a governing board, which is made up by local governments, and so the decisions being made by that governing board are being made by local government officials for the benefit of local governments. We have professional investment advisors, as I mentioned earlier, and of course it's funded. It's audited as well. Most LGIPs, which by the way Epic does, allow same day or next day withdrawals. Obviously, wire ACH transfers, very convenient. So it's ideal for operating cash, short-term reserves, that type of stuff. Earnings are credited. You talk to Marty about that if you're interested on how that happens. But these are, again, authorized by New York State municipal law. They're great opportunities for you to invest money into short-term instruments that preserve principal and preserve liquidity. And if it's capital reserve, if it's unrestricted funds, whatever it is, very much something that you can look at. I would suggest you look at how this fits. Talk to your town board talk with your comptroller, your finance director, see how it fits into your investment policy, see how it invests into your, or fits into your strategies of dealing with short-term cash needs and cash flow. But I bring it up as a way to really suggest that this concern the state may have that towns aren't able to manage their own funds is legitimate from the perspective is towns are not you're not fund managers, right? You don't manage money. You don't buy your treasuries on your own. You don't do that. But there are programs that municipal governments have available to them, EPIC being one of them. There's other LGIPs out there. EPIC is the one that NIOT has sponsored. It is one that we are partnering with. But there is an opportunity to create an OPEB reserve fund and to help them then through the LGIPs manage that fund. To me, I think removes the only concern the state may have as to why they don't allow an OPEB. So, these are all the things that we are working on here at the association. I hope that I didn't overly bore you on future health insurance or health retiree obligations going forward, but it's an important topic. And we want to take this opportunity to talk to you about important topics. And again, let you know that there's really two paths here. One, legislatively, if you can help us, talk to your legislator, talk to your senator, your assembly member who represents you about this brewing crisis in your budget and talk about how we can maybe address it. Go online, get our legislative program. You'll see all the different legislative program agendas that we have there. And, as we get towards the end of session and, God willing, a budget soon, it's a little bit late, but once we get a budget, we'll have Sarah Brancatella back on here, talk a little bit about that. But secondly, the association, as I mentioned earlier, is addressing issues with our programming. We are building health insurance consortiums. If you're interested in getting into a health insurance consortium, we need you to respond. There's no obligation to this, but we do need you to engage so that we can do an analysis of the consortium. And if you're interested in that, email me, C. Ketzle, that's C-K-O-E-T-Z-L-E, that's K-O-E, T as in Tom, Z as in zebra, L-E, at nytowns.org. And let me know if you're interested, because we'll work on that. But in the meantime, this OPEB issue we're really focused on, and if you want any more information on it, if you want to talk about it, email me, email Marty over at the EPIC Fund, PFM, and we will continue to work very hard on it. If you have an issue that you want discussed here, or you want us to look at, please email us. You can go to nytowns.org, always email through there. You can email me directly, cketzle at nytowns.org. Just let us know. We'd love to bring any issues forward, and we will be back again with another exciting episode and a more, again, not more interesting than OPEB, but another interesting episode on Talk of the Towns.